Good morning. So today what we're going to be talking about is we are going to be talking about central and inscribed angles. So when we're talking about central and inscribed angles, we have to know, what does it actually look like when we write it in our math language? So I'm going to draw a circle, and then I'm going to draw some angles. So I'm going to draw one. Let me make sure I know my center. I'm going to draw one that looks like this, one that looks like this, and then one that looks like this. It doesn't have to be perfect. That's just what I got. And I'm going to label it so it's A, B, C, D. Then I'm going to give this angle a measure of 140 degrees. And I'm going to give this angle a measure of 80 degrees. And I'm going to give this arc a measure of 85 degrees. So that's just, we're setting up so we can start looking at this circle. And yes, it's not drawn to scale because 80 and 140 look the same. Bear with me. So when we are talking about circles, we can talk about their arcs. So those are like the parts of the circumference. They're called arcs. And the angles, which are the angles inside. So one way you can see them written is, say we're talking about this arc right here that I'm going to draw in orange. So we can label that as arc DC, or sometimes you'll see it as arc DC with this little arc over it, and it means that this is what you're talking about. Say we want to talk about the angle that's associated with that arc. So this angle here, we would name it angle D. This is the origin, so I'm going to put OC. So that would be angle DOC. So this is just a little bit of how we can talk about our things. So again, say we want to talk about this arc right here. We would write arc AD. You could also write DA, works the same. And your arcs don't just have to be from one point to the other. You could also talk, say I wanted to talk about this entire arc going from here all the way to here. The way you would write that arc is you would write it with what you see. So every point you cross. So it would be arc D, C, B, because those are all the points I cross from the arc. If I just said arc DB, I don't know if I'm going this way or if I'm going this way. So that's why I have to talk about the C, because it says I am going to the right to create that arc. One other thing to remember when we're talking about circles is circles are out of 360 degrees. And this is true both for the way around the circle is 360 degrees, and the angles inside the circle are 360 degrees. So this is like the base knowledge that's going to help you with central and inscribed angles today. So we're going to start by talking about central angles. So central angles. And what central angles are, they're angles whose vertex goes through the center. So it goes through the center of the circle, which means while we're looking at here, all four of these angles that we drew are all central angles because they all go through the vertex of our circle. What we need to know about those is that the measure of the angle equals the measure of the arc. And I'm lazy, so I like to do math speak sometimes when I write. And this can also be written as like the measure of the angle equals the measure of whatever arc. This M just means measure. So let's see, what does this mean? So for example, say I was trying to find the measure of angle DC. All right, I'm gonna look back up here. My measure of angle DC, that's my orange arc. And we said earlier that orange arc relates, let's see, let's make it into an angle. We connect the two ends and it matches with the measure of angle DOC. Because that arc, that crust of the pizza makes that angle. So the angle is that pizza, the arc is the crust. So, and we know the measure of angle DOC is 140 degrees. They're equal, so the measure of arc DC is also 140 degrees. It's the same exact thing, nothing changes. Let's see, what if we wanted to find the measure of arc AD? Same thing, I'm gonna look over here. All right, AD is in red. I'm gonna trace here to see where it makes my slice. It hits right here. So we're looking at the measure of angle AOD, which is 80 degrees. Oops, that's not supposed to say 800, that's 80 degrees, which means the measure of arc AD is 80 degrees. So we know we can find the arc from the angle. We can also find the angle from the arc. We can do that same thing backwards. So say we wanted to find the measure of angle COD. So I'm gonna look over here. All right, I have angle C. My O is my origin. And, oh, that's supposed to say a B, my bad. COB. So if I was to make that arc, I started here and I ended over here. Sketching is my favorite thing with arcs because I can see it clearly. So it says my arc length right here is the measure of my arc is CB is 85 degrees. That means the measure of angle COB is also 85 degrees. So that part, we just know that this angle and this arc, if it's a central angle, is the same thing. Say I wanted to get a little more complicated, and I wanted to know, okay, what's the measure of arc DCB? So that's this big arc here. Well, I know part of the arc is 85, but I also learned up here that this part is 140. So I can add those two arcs together. So I can add the measure of arc DC plus the measure of arc CB. So I can add those two little arcs to give me that bigger arc that I want. I know because I already did some of the math that arc DC is 140 and I know CB is 85. So the measure of arc DCB is 225 degrees. And notice how I'm putting degrees for all of these because we're talking about the degrees of a circle. So that's the central angle, where the central angle and the arc length are the same. Next thing, we're going to talk about the inscribed angle. Inscribed angles. So for inscribed angles, they're angles whose vertex lies on the circumference. So this means we're going to have to do some math because this is a little bit different. So for example, when we're talking about them, the measure of the arc equals 2 times the measure of the angle, or the measure of the angle equals the measure of the arc divided by 2. And remember, I'm lazy, that's why this just looks like gibberish. If you want to write down the words, that will make more sense for you, definitely do that. So let's look at an example. So I'm going to draw my circle here. And I'm going to draw kind of this little crisscrossy thing here in my circle. I'm going to label, I have A, B, C, D, because I'm going to label my sides. I'm going to say, just because I can, this angle inside here is 40 degrees. This arc over here is 50 degrees. So I'm just saying these are the parts of the circle I know. So in this case, looking at this, we have 2 different inscribed angles. We have, if I cover this up, we have this first angle that all 3 points hit the circumference. Then we have this second angle that all 3 points hit the circumference. So let's try to use this map to find out some different pieces of it. So if I wanted to try to find the measure of angle AB, all right, I look in arc AB is right here, which means the angle that coincides, if I was to make that pizza slice, is the measure of angle ADB, which is 40 degrees. I have an angle, I want to find an arc, so I multiply by 2. When I multiply by 2, that will give me 80 degrees, which is the measure of the arc. All we did is multiply by 2. Let's say I want to go the other way. So let's say I want to find the measure of angle CBD. So I look, all right, CBD. If I trace it, that means it's this arc that it goes with, which is the measure of arc DC. DC is 50 degrees. All right, I know the arc, I want to find the angle. That means I divide by 2. So I'm going to divide by 2, which is going to give me 25 degrees, which is the measure of angle CBD. So the big difference between inscribed angles and central angles is where that vertex is located. So if it's located in the center, you don't really have to do much math. The angle is the same as the arc. If it's an inscribed angle and the vertex is on the circumference, that means that you have to either multiply 2 or divide by 2 to get what you want. So we're going to do some practice with this. Make sure you're asking questions. Y'all got this.